In 1803, a single bank financed the largest military campaign Europe had ever seen. It moved gold across borders, paid armies, and kept entire governments afloat during the Napoleonic Wars. By 1818, that same bank had ceased to exist. No collapse, no scandal. It simply closed its doors and disappeared from the records. The men who ran it walked away wealthy. The nations it funded were left with debts that would shape the next century. This is the story of the bank that powered an empire and then erased itself. To understand how one institution could finance a continent at war and then vanish, you need to understand early 19th century banking. Nation states did not have central banks in the modern sense. Governments borrowed from private merchant banks, often family run operations with branches across multiple countries. These banks did not answer to parliaments or monarchs, they answered to their investors. And during wartime, they became more powerful than the armies they funded. One such institution was Hope and Company, a Dutch banking house with offices in Amsterdam, London, and Paris. By the turn of the 19th century, Hope and Company had become the primary financier for European powers locked in conflict. They arranged loans for Britain, Russia, and Austria. They moved bullion across war zones. They discounted government bonds and resold them at profit. But when Napoleon rose to power, something shifted. Hope and Company began working both sides. In 1803, the United States negotiated the Louisiana Purchase with France. Napoleon needed cash immediately to fund his military ambitions. The transaction was worth $15 million, an astronomical sum at the time. The problem was France could not collect the money directly from the United States. Britain controlled the seas. Any transfer of gold would be intercepted. So Napoleon turned to Hope and Company. The bank arranged the payment through a structure involving bonds, credit transfers, and intermediary accounts in London. The United States paid Hope and Company. Hope and Company paid France through discounted bonds that could be traded on European markets. Britain never blocked the transaction because, on paper, it looked like a private commercial loan between merchants. No gold crossed the Atlantic. No ships were at risk. The money moved through ledgers and letters of credit. This was financial engineering before the term existed. The Louisiana Purchase, one of the largest land deals in history, was processed through a private bank using methods that governments could not regulate. And Hope and Company took a percentage of every step. The bonds were discounted. The credit lines carried interest. The transfers had fees. By the time the money reached Napoleon, the bank had extracted millions in profit. But Hope and Company was not only working for France. At the same time the bank was facilitating Napoleon's payments, it was also holding debt issued by the British government. The bank had arranged loans for Austria and Russia, both fighting against France. This was not a conflict of interest because the bank was not a state actor. It was a private entity. Its obligation was to its investors, not to any nation. This created a perverse dynamic. The longer the wars continued, the more governments borrowed. The more they borrowed, the more the banks profited. Peace was bad for business. Debt was the product, and Hope and Company had become one of the central dealers in that product. By 1815, the wars were over. Napoleon was defeated. The Congress of Vienna redrew the map, and the bills came due. Britain had borrowed more than £800 million during the Napoleonic Wars. France owed hundreds of millions of francs. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and the smaller states were buried under obligations they could not service. The men who had arranged these loans were not held accountable. There were no trials, no investigations. The debt was sovereign. It belonged to the states. The profits were private. They belonged to the banks. And then, quietly, Hope and Company began to withdraw. Between 1815 and 1818, the bank restructured its operations. Certain divisions were dissolved. Key partners retired. The firm stopped accepting new government contracts. It stopped appearing in diplomatic records. The archives that once referenced Hope and Company transactions fell silent. The bank did not collapse. There was no scandal, no dramatic failure. The institution simply receded. Some family members invested their fortunes in real estate and industry. Others moved to Britain or America. The mechanisms they had built were absorbed into the broader banking system. But the name itself faded. What remained was the debt, and that debt restructured Europe. Smaller states that could not service their loans were absorbed into larger empires. Italy and Germany began unification partly because fragmented states could not manage the financial burden. Britain's dominance in global finance was built on its ability to service debt others could not. France cycled through governments, in part because Napoleonic obligations never disappeared. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States. The debt Britain took on created the foundation for imperial financial infrastructure. The bonds traded during those years became the template for modern sovereign debt markets. Every piece of the modern system carries fingerprints from this era, and the bank that sat at the center, the institution that moved billions in today's terms across borders and battle lines, left almost no trace. There are records and archives, references and letters, but no monument, no museum, no public memory. This is not about conspiracy. It is about a system that allowed private institutions to profit from public suffering without consequence. Wars were funded, debts accumulated, profits were privatized, losses were socialized, and the institutions that facilitated it all operated where borders could not reach. Hope and Company disappeared because it no longer needed to exist in its original form. The model had been proven, the infrastructure had been built, the next generation would carry it forward, and the world they helped create is the one we live in now.